Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'd like to welcome you back to another in our series of NRL live streaming sessions. Every other week on Wednesdays at this same time, we will discuss a new topic and want to encourage you to provide as much input as possible by calling or texting us with your questions or comments. You can call or text us toll free at 1 844 424 0500. That's 1 844 424 0500. And just to remind people, we are doing these radio shows and streaming sessions to help community members and the general public get a better understanding of what is involved in the federal impact assessment and provincial environmental assessment processes, and encourage viewers and listeners to participate in these two activities. With me today is my usual co-host, Mr. Qasim Sadiq, who is the project co-lead for the Northern Road Link project. Good afternoon, Qasim. You're all rested, relaxed, ready for another live streaming session, I would imagine.
Absolutely, Don. That's what the 2 week gap does. It just gives us a little bit of an opportunity to recuperate and come back to talk about these very important topics. And I think the discussion today sort of puts us in a different light for the project, and a timely and important discussion given the new leg of work that's now starting with the project.
So true, Qasim. And this is an interesting topic, and and probably a lot of people don't realize how important this is to an environmental assessment. Today's topic is called field studies, geology, terrain, and soils. And as you can imagine, we're going to talk about geology, terrain, and soil investigations that will be done as part of this environmental or impact assessment. So before we get started, maybe Qasim, you can do a quick run through of what we're going to cover today.
So, in today's live streaming session, we'll start with a discussion on, what the geology, terrain, and soil study plan objectives are. Then we'll talk about overall purpose of field studies on geology, terrain, and soils. Then we discuss geology, terrain, and soil investigations. How do they help in EA and an IA? We'll discuss the different activities within geology, terrain, and soils. For example, we'll talk about drilling and well investigation, soil and sediment sampling, aggregate source investigations, geotechnical field investigations, and geochemical investigations. Then we'll talk a little bit about what has been done so far. And lastly, as always, we'll leave our listeners with our contact information.
That's great. Thank you, Qasim. And maybe let's get things started now with a brief discussion of the objectives of the study plan for geology, terrain, and soils. And uh, the study plans are the detailed work plans for each study that makes up the environmental assessment or impact assessment. So these take the terms of reference and go into much more detail in terms of the protocols for the different activities within each study. So there's a lot to these, and maybe let's have a look now if our team. Oh, there they go. Look at them. They've got that up on the screen already. So let's talk about what the work plan or study plan involves. It involves collecting baseline information on the Earth structure and the makeup of the composition of the Earth structure, sort of. So the different layers of soil below the surface. It involves baseline data collection of related to geochemistry, so the chemistry associated with the rocks that are in the subsurface. Geohazards. So geohazards. I mean, you can imagine geohazards that in some environments would be things like earthquakes or volcanoes. Um, those are less relevant, as you can imagine, in this study area. What we're talking about when we talk about geohazards here is more things like erosion or soil loss. Those are the kinds of geohazards we typically would deal with in an area like this. We're also collecting baseline information as part of this work on on the height of the land or the topography. This was done as part of earlier LIDAR studies where we use a fixed wing aircraft that emits lasers and measures the time it takes for those signals to be reflected back, and they're able to tie that time to the actual height of the land. So there, that's sort of another activity that's done under the umbrella of geology, terrain, and soils. And then there's soils and sediment. So soil, I think we all know what soil is, but sediment relates to the bottoms of lakes and rivers. So that's what we mean when we talk about sediment. So, in terms of objectives of the work, there's a number of objectives when it comes to geology, terrain, and soils work. Um, Obviously, the first one would be to describe the geology both locally, very close to the project, and regionally, to describe any geological hazards such as erosion, as I mentioned before, to determine the chemistry of materials that could be used for construction. So, if rock or gravel is used for the purposes of construction, we need to understand whether that rock or gravel has certain chemicals in it that, when oxidized or exposed to air and perhaps water as well, that might cause acids to form, which could then have impacts on, for example, fish and fish habitat. So this is an important objective of this work, and as well. Another objective is to describe the potential for contamination of soils or sediments, and then finally describing soil layers and depths. And the purposes of this is to better understand um, the capacity of the land to have a road on it, for example, or at a water crossing area, understanding the layers of soil so that you can understand how to maybe engineer the bridge, the foundations for the bridges. So there's a lot of objectives associated with these studies, and maybe Qasim, if our team can move to slide number three, or sorry, slide number four, maybe you can go through the overall purpose of these studies.
Yeah, so the overall purpose of the field studies is essentially an attempt to characterize existing conditions. Any project undergoing an environmental assessment process attempts to understand the general environment in which the project is being built. What does the environment look like at the moment before the project is built? Especially to be able to identify and evaluate alternatives in the future. You don't want to judge alternatives just on their own independent merits, but you want to judge them based on the potential impact of the alternatives on the natural environment, on existing conditions as well. So you can't do that till you characterize existing conditions, till you collect information and baseline conditions knowledge through fieldwork and field studies. When it comes to geology, terrain, and soils, of course, it helps you understand how to evaluate different alternatives based on the soil conditions, based on the terrain. But it enables you to take another important step in preliminary civil and structural engineering, to be able to say that from an engineering perspective, the design of the road should look like this based on geology, terrain, and soils. And it also helps sort of differentiate between the two options available. So, well, two options or whatever number of options or alternatives that might be on the table for a particular project. And that is only possible once you collect this type of baseline information on.
Thanks, Qasim. And if we can go to slide number 5, the next question is, how do these field investigations help an environmental assessment or impact assessment? Well, they can help it in many ways. And one of those is by facilitating the identification of potential sources. So, of aggregate. When I talk about aggregate, I'm talking about materials like gravel, finer material that could be used as a road base. And where that's not available, what happens is they look for areas where bedrock is readily available, and then that bedrock is then accessed, and then it's processed, it's crushed to get the size that's needed to build the road base. So these kind of investigations are done to not only identify where the aggregate might be or where the bedrock might be, but also later on the extent of it, right? So is there a big enough supply or reserve or deposit, I guess is the best word, of bedrock or aggregate in an area, and is it close enough to the road to make it feasible, usable for the project. So another way that these investigations can help in EA or IA is characterization of stream crossings, and I talked a bit about this earlier. So understanding what the soil types are, where given the best place to maybe cross a water course, whether it's a lake or a river, um, looking at the soil where the bridge supports or the foundations for the bridges might be. So that's another investigation that would be done, and that helps the EA or IA. Another one is mapping of route alternatives. So as we all know, we have a number of route alternatives associated with this project. So um, looking at the terrain where these different alternatives are located. There might be additional investigations to sort of confirm or understand more about particular routes, and it maybe that's one of the ways you can help narrow down the number of alternatives to a preferred alternative. It certainly is one important source of information in doing that. And then the other one I have here on slide number 5 is the identification of the optimal, the best possible geotechnical route. So when I talk about geotechnical, I mean sort of it's engineering related considerations associated with the subsurface, with soil and rock. Um, and so identifying the best route based on the terrain and the engineering considerations. And all of this is just to remind everyone, all of this is being done. There's consultation being done in parallel with these activities. So it's sort of an iterative, a two-way process where the consultation feedback that we're getting can feed in and help direct our field activities, and information goes the other way as well too. So there's a lot of different ways that geology, terrain, and soils can help an EA. And why don't we now, Qasim, look at a big part of these studies, and that's the drilling and well investigation work.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about those field activities, drilling and field investigation. So the drilling part enables soil logging or recording of the stratigraphy or the layers of soil and their respective thickness. The way I like to think about that is that think of if you think about or picture a layered cake, every layer has a different thickness, and that's not very different from the layers of soil. So there's a need to understand what that individual respective layer looks like and what is that thickness, and that's done through a drilling program. Now, a continuation of that drilling program would be to install wells, but for a completely different purpose, which is the measurement of groundwater level and quality. Now, when we talk about level, of course, that's That's self-explanatory, which is how deep or at what depth would groundwater begin at that sort of well station, and then you want to monitor the quality of the water at that location as well. That essentially becomes your baseline. That before the project started, this was the quality of the ground water in the project area. And any impact that you want to measure in the future of the project on the groundwater is against that quality which is measured before the project is started. So, in terms of activities, drilling and well investigation, both are sort of, they start with drilling, and then when drilling expands, you can install wells. They're two separate programs typically. One enables you to understand the layers of the soil and their respective thickness, and the other one enables the project to understand the level at which groundwater begins and the quality of that groundwater, Don.
So true, Qasim. And one thing I will add, and we discussed this a bit in the radio show earlier today, is that these kinds of investigations are very challenging to execute because they involve, especially in remote areas like this, where there's no roads that lead directly to where the drilling occurs. So they're often expensive because the work is done by helicopter. They're complicated because there's a lot of equipment involved, and the equipment can fail, and there's a lot of permitting involved in this as well too. So these kinds of field studies take a lot of time and effort both to plan and to execute, and sometimes Mother Nature isn't our friend. Our field teams have been up over the last couple of weeks and have been really challenged by some of the snowstorms that have limited the ability of the helicopter to get out and help with the field investigation. So that's been a bit of a challenge. But let's talk now, if our team can move to slide number 7, please. Slide number 7. Let's talk now about soil and sediment sampling. And again, sediment is the bottom of lakes and rivers, so it's basically soil that's underwater. And so these kinds of activities, they're determining soil types in specific kinds of areas. So areas are selected based on a review of what we call superficial geology, so the top level of top geological layer closest to the ground surface. Quaternary deposits are the most recently laid geologic layers. And then we look at bedrock geology as well as part of this, and the soil and rock samples are are collected and submitted, and we talked a little bit about this before, for what we call acid rock drainage and metal leaching lab analysis. So that we can understand whether certain rocks contain minerals or certain chemicals that might be released and enter the water column uh, through leaching, through exposure to water, or become acids by exposure to air, by exposure to oxygen. So these are key activities involved in this program. And then once the watercourse crossing locations have been confirmed, sediment samples where those crossings are going to occur. So samples from the lake bottom or river bottom where that crossing is going to occur are collected and then sent for lab analysis to understand. Again, this is all about the baseline, defining the baseline and understanding what the composition of the sediment is at the water crossing location. So that's a really important activity associated with that. And once the project related or temporary or permanent infrastructure has been sort of identified in terms of the location. There's further work that's done in terms of terrain and soil investigations, because those are facilities that are required as part of the project. They are part of the project. But once we know where they are, we have to sample these areas to understand what the soil types are there. And as I mentioned before, to delineate or to outline the extent of a deposit, of whether it's gravel or bedrock as well too. So there's a lot of activities. They don't all the geology and terrain and soils work doesn't happen in one visit. It happens over a period of time because it's done at different points in time as the work moves along. And if our team can move to slide number 8, please, the tech team. Hopefully this graphic will help people understand. I think Qasim was talking about it. He gave a very good analogy of a cake. And let's take a look at that image on your screen here, the soil layers image, where you've got sort of the top layer, they call it the humus layer, and then below that topsoil, the darker type of soil that we typically see, and then you have the subsoil layer, and then you might have um, a groundwater layer, or a layer where there's fractures in rock and water is sitting, and the groundwater is sort of percolated through to that point, and then below that you have the bedrock, and again the thickness of these layers changes depending on where you are, and you can't always it's not always perfectly predictable, no matter how much information you have, until you actually go and drill in some of these locations. And then the image in the middle is a it's hard to see here exactly, but it's a profile of the soil layers over from a borehole that's been taken as well. So hopefully that makes it a little bit easier to understand for our viewers. And maybe now, Qasim, you can go through the aggregate. Tell us a bit about the aggregate source investigations.
So that's another activity associated with the geology, terrain, and soil investigations program, uh, to understand aggregates available in the project area. Now, for the construction of a road project, aggregates are such an important component of the overall project, because you can't really build a road without an aggregate source. And you want it to be as close to the project as possible, because you can minimize the haulage distance, which means it saves on the cost side of things, but it also reduces emissions associated with that haulage. So as part of this program, you conduct preliminary work to identify possible granular landforms and possible quarry sites, which are reasonably close to the preferred corridor. As I said, you don't want them to be too far away, but at times you might not have a viable option very close to the project. The most promising prospects, they will be selected with input from communities that are close by to that source. If we get something which is close to the project itself, it's very likely to be in Martin Falls and Webquay traditional territory, but it might be a little further away, just depending on where the source is. And those communities that are closest to that site, whose traditional territory is involved, we would conduct consultation and engagement with those communities around the possible use of that aggregate source. Then you conduct some field reconnaissance work. On the granular prospect side, you basically develop small test holes that are dug at a depth of 50 centimeters to assess material gradation and quality. On the potential quarry side, and to assess bedrock prospect, you conduct more comprehensive drilling to describe the suitability of the aggregate and riprap material production. So those drill holes would be at a depth of 15 meters. So a slightly bigger drilling program is involved to develop an understanding of that side of aggregate investigation, Don.
Thanks, Qasim. And let's move now to a brief discussion on the geotechnical field investigation. So when I use the term geotechnical, I'm referring to the engineering related considerations associated with the subsurface, the soils and rock um, uh, that are part of the study area. So these are initially done along the preliminary proposed corridors, and then investigations as as things get narrowed down and you identify a preferred corridor. There's additional investigations that are undertaken after that, and the purpose of these kinds of investigations is to look at the condition below the surface, uh, along the corridor and at the water body crossings, and also in the access roads and the other areas, lay down areas, or the pits and quarries as well too. Um, the other purpose is also to identify potential aggregate sources. We do these investigations again to understand, oh wow, there might be some gravel here, there's a possibility this has some potential. And all these geotechnical investigations in particular, because of their engineering related focus, provide uh, provide the design engineers, and the construction specialist with information that helps them sort of get a better understanding of the project. It allows them to refine estimates, cost estimates, because they learn more about the terrain and what they would be dealing with if they were to actually design at a detailed level and actually build the project. So there's a lot of information that's gained from these geotechnical investigations. And when these are done, we talked a bit about this before. Soils, there's a profile that's developed, right? That you're drilling a borehole and you're doing a soil profile. You're doing a borehole log, which identifies the soil, specific soil type, and there's specific names for these different soils and that are defined by particle sizes, and then there's an extent for each one. So from depth of 2 meters below the surface to through 3 meters of surface, we found shale, for example. That's just sort of how it's a sort of a standardized way of recording or logging um, the subsurface when doing these drilling investigations. And then there's further tests. There's tests done as well to evaluate the strength of the soils for engineering purposes. Things like standard penetration testing. There's photographs taken. So there's a lot of sort of documentation that is undertaken as part of this work. So Casa, maybe now you can talk a bit about the geochemical investigations.
Yeah, another sort of really interesting part of this process, Don. One of the field activities associated with this, with the geology, terrain, and soil investigation, relates to geochemical investigation, in which soil and rock sampling and testing is done to identify different types of mineralization present in the aggregate. And rock, particularly for the northern road link and the eskers and potential borrow areas, because we're trying to assess acid rock drainage, or metal leaching at quarries, rock cuts, talus sites, and locations where soil materials are generated and stockpiled. So the purpose of doing this is really to predict metal leaching and acid rock drainage. Now, acid rock drainage sounds a little daunting, particularly in a road project. And it sounds like, it's something nefarious that the proponent might be up to. But interestingly, it's something that exists naturally in the environment. And the way acid rock drainage or metal leaching is defined is that, when you expose and disturb sulfide bearing rocks, or naturally mineralized sulfide rocks, then they can cause the release of acid runoff. So those sulfides get exposed to the natural environment that can potentially turn into, for example, sulfuric acid. The runoff, of course, can damage different parts of the environment depending on how acidic it is. It can damage aquatic habitats, kill fish, contaminate water supplies. It can also impact the life of the asset by impacting or corroding concrete foundations and bridges, metal culverts, as well as pipes. So it does require management. Unfortunately, if you investigate that and you do your homework, this is something which can be managed and mitigated. But to be able to do that, you need to understand what exists in the natural environment.
Thanks, Qasim. So what has been done so far in regard to the geology, terrain, and soils field studies? Let's have a quick look. So if we can turn to slide number 12. And so the plan as of right now is to drill up to 18 boreholes for terrain mapping and route evaluation. Our team has been up at the project site for approximately 2 weeks and has drilled some boreholes so far, but as I mentioned before, has been challenged by the weather. They've installed, I believe, 4 wells. So they've installed 4 groundwater monitoring wells, which would be used to they would be sampling the groundwater, as Qasim had talked about earlier, and we would also be I think in every case measuring the groundwater levels, so we can look at how the levels change over time, for example, from season to season. So um, that just about wraps everything up. And maybe Qasim, you can identify for our viewers the many ways that they can contact us.
Absolutely, Don. As always, please feel free to get in touch with us by phone at 1-888-515-3607, by email at info@northernroadlink.com. And probably the easiest way, if you can't take a note of this, is through the website at northernroadlink.ca, where this information is available, as well as a quick contact us form.
Thank you, Qasim. And that wraps up today's NRL discussion. Thank you, as always, for sharing your thoughts in this discussion, Qasim. And I hope our viewers and listeners found it helpful, and maybe it helped them understand the project a little bit better and some of the activities associated with the project. So we invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we're going to continue our field studies discussions with a chat about the waterfowl and breeding birds field studies. Don't forget to visit our site, as Qasim mentioned, at northernroadlink.ca, or follow us on social media at NRL Roadlink. Miigwech, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much.